Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering your country has, well, essentially installed a completely parallel operating system for its government.
Oh, wow, yeah. That is a wild thought.
Right. One that fundamentally changes who holds power and how decisions are actually made. Because today, in May 2026, the Australian Constitution remains completely untouched.
Yeah, not a single word changed.
Exactly. I mean, we are nearly 3 years removed from the 2023 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament referendum,
Yeah.
and the result was a very definitive no.
It was. But when you really pull back the curtain and dig into the stacks of, academic papers, legal analyses, and those old policy documents from that era,
You realize just how breathtakingly close the country came to doing exactly that, rewriting its entire national operating system.
Oh,
We are
man.
looking at a profound crossroad.
the failure of the referendum certainly cemented our current reality, sure. But the documents prepared during that whole debate, they offer this highly detailed, totally functional blueprint of a completely different Australian state.
Which is so rare.
It really is. It's rare to have such a comprehensively mapped out alternative future for a modern democracy just sitting right there in the archives.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because our mission for this deep dive is to literally step directly into that alternate reality.
I love it. Let's do it.
Think of history like a massive choose-your-own-adventure book, right?
Yeah.
Today, we're keeping our finger firmly on the page of reality, where the referendum failed, but we're flipping ahead to see what the path not taken actually looked like.
Right.
So, what would the Australian constitutional, political, and social landscape look like today if the voice had actually passed?
What's fascinating here is that counterfactual history, this whole what-if scenario we are doing, isn't just a fantasy exercise.
Yeah.
It is actually a really vital analytical tool. When we explore the structural mechanisms the voice would have introduced, it exposes the deep philosophical foundations of how a state operates.
So it's not just a hypothetical game.
Exactly. The sources we have make it incredibly clear. The voice was never just some minor policy debate about, adding a new advisory committee. It was a massive structural reform capable of redefining the Australian state's very DNA.
And whether you are an Australian policy wonk or honestly just someone fascinated by how nations govern themselves, this deep dive is going to reveal how just a few carefully chosen words inserted into a constitution can completely redirect a country's trajectory.
Completely.
So, to understand this alternate future, we really have to start with the fundamental architectural change the voice represented. We're talking about a massive shift in the very nature of Australian sovereignty.
Right.
But I want to avoid the dense textbook definitions here. What does that actually mean for the structure of the country?
Well, so the academic literature describes this shift as moving from a traditional mononational Westminster system into something called multinational federalism.
Multinational federalism. Okay.
Yeah. In a standard Westminster system, you basically have a single, unified source of sovereignty, right? The crown, which is represented by the parliament.
That's the system we're all used to.
Exactly. But a successful insertion of Section 129 into the Constitution, which would have formally recognized Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples, that changes the entire calculus.
It breaks the mold.
It does. It introduces this concept of a double federation.
Okay, wait. I hear double federation, and my immediate thought is, like, a fractured country.
Sure, that's a common reaction.
Because under our normal system, you have the standard federal and state distribution of power. We all know how that works. But if you have two parallel systems running, a standard federation and an Indigenous federation, aren't we just setting up permanent gridlock?
It sounds like it, yeah.
I mean, how does a nation operate two parallel operating systems without just completely crashing?
It is a totally common intuition to view it that way, but the political theorists in our sources, they argue that multinational federalism doesn't actually divide the nation.
It doesn't.
No, rather it acknowledges the existing complexities that the state has previously just tried to ignore. It's about shared sovereignty, not fractured sovereignty.
Shared, not fractured.
Exactly. Think about how Australian federalism has historically operated. It has internalized Indigenous relations.
Meaning what exactly?
Meaning Indigenous communities were treated as matters of local or regional administrative governance. They were managed almost like a municipality or just a specific demographic minority.
So the government treats it as just an internal management problem to be solved by some department in Canberra.
Right, exactly. But by constitutionally enshrining the voice at the federal level, that entire relationship would be elevated. The scholars call this the externalization of Indigenous affairs.
Externalization. Wow.
Yeah. It would basically align the Commonwealth's relationship with Indigenous peoples much closer to the realm of international law and diplomacy.
So it treats them differently.
It treats Indigenous peoples as sovereign polities rather than just, another minority group within the state. The goal is to bring Australia in line with a treaty federalism model.
Okay, so creating a permanent institutional bridge capable of resolving those historical differences through, structured dialogue rather than just ongoing political friction.
Exactly. That's the hope.
So instead of treating Indigenous communities like a local city council that needs managing, the government would have to treat them almost like a foreign nation at a diplomatic summit.
In a structural sense, yes.
That is a massive paradigm shift. But that brings us from the high-level constitutional theory down to the actual day-to-day mechanics.
The real-world application.
Right, because having a double federation is a great concept for, a political science seminar. But how does an Indigenous community actually stop a poorly planned federal project before the concrete is poured?
That's the real test.
The answer, looking at the proposed text of the referendum, lies in the voice's ability to talk not just to the parliament, but to the executive branch of government.
And that inclusion of the executive government in the proposed Section 129 is absolutely critical to understanding how this alternate reality would have worked.
It's the core of it.
It really is. The amendment would have empowered the voice to make representations to both the parliament and the executive on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples.
Which is huge.
Because the vast majority of actual policy development and the really granular on-the-ground service delivery, that all happens in bureaucratic departments and the cabinet. It doesn't happen on the floor of the parliament.
Right, because parliament basically just passes a broad law. It's the executive, the civil servants, the department heads, the actual agencies that figures out how to actually implement it on the ground.
Exactly. And to see how that parallel system functions in practice, we have to look at the Kalma-Langton model.
Right. I saw that in the documents.
Yeah, this was the comprehensive co-design report commissioned by the government to outline the actual machinery of the voice. It proposed a national voice consisting of 24 members, drawing representatives from literally every state and territory.
So it wasn't just a national thing.
Right. No, importantly, this wasn't just a top-down Canberra bureaucracy. The national body was to be supported by 35 local and regional voices.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the academic literature points out a massive difference between what governments usually call consultation and what the voice aimed to do, which is authentic co-design.
The difference is night and day.
Let me use an analogy here. Standard government consultation is, it's like a restaurant asking you to fill out a comment card after you've already eaten a terrible meal.
Yeah, exactly.
They might read it, they might not, but the meal's already cooked. The Kalma-Langton model of co-design is like inviting the customer into the kitchen to help write the recipe and pick the ingredients before anyone even turns on the stove.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. Let's look at how this applies to a real-world scenario from the sources, like healthcare policy.
Okay, let's hear it.
The systemic literature reviews we have on Indigenous health and education show that past government interventions frequently failed precisely because they didn't alter those foundational power dynamics.
They were just comment cards.
Right. So imagine a new federal health clinic is being planned for a remote community in the Pilbara. Under the Kalma-Langton model, the local regional voice doesn't just send a memo to Canberra after the blueprints are drawn.
In the room.
Yes. They sit at the table with the health department bureaucrats before the budget is even finalized. The explicit goal was to decolonize these systems by integrating Indigenous knowledge at the very inception point of policy.
But, okay, I have to ask the obvious question here. If the voice is strictly an advisory body, which the proposed amendment explicitly stated, meaning it had absolutely no legal veto power over legislation, what actually forces a government to listen?
That is the big question.
Right. I mean, if a bureaucrat in the health department wants to just ignore the local voice's input on that Pilbara clinic, what stops them? What makes this co-design any different from a standard government focus group that politicians just routinely ignore when it's politically convenient?
That is literally the pivotal question of the entire model. The experts and legal scholars point to the concept of the political and moral veto.
A moral veto, yeah.
Yeah. While the government wouldn't be legally bound to follow the advice, the political and moral weight of a constitutionally enshrined body is just immense.
So they can't just brush it off.
Exactly. The logic presented in the supportive literature is that it would be only a brave government that would ignore the direct public representations of the voice without providing a massive, publicly defensible justification.
So it's about transparency.
Completely. The mechanism forces transparency. If the government ignores the recipe, to use your restaurant analogy, they have to publicly explain exactly why they are serving the meal anyway. It acts as a functional check on executive power through purely moral authority.
But that exact mechanism, the voice's access to the executive and its immense moral weight, was the precise epicenter of the opposition's deepest fears.
Oh, without a doubt.
It put the nation on a total constitutional collision course. And looking at the sources, the debate over the legal risks of this executive access was incredibly intense.
Highly, highly polarized.
We really have to look at both sides of this carefully because the legal arguments from 2023 were deeply complex and neither side backed down.
Right. The tension centered entirely on the unknown, which was how the High Court of Australia would eventually interpret the voice's powers over the executive. Let's examine the critical view first.
Okay, what were the critics saying?
The primary anxiety outlined in legal analyses, including those pointing to the Institute of Public Affairs, was that the voice would essentially mutate into a third chamber of parliament or like a fourth branch of government entirely.
Because the phrase in the proposed amendment was matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Critics argued that phrasing is practically limitless. Because Indigenous people are Australian citizens, every single policy, defense, taxation, welfare, national infrastructure, it all affects them.
Yes.
Therefore, the voice could theoretically demand to weigh in on literally everything the government does.
And that critical view extended directly to fears of judicial activism. The real concern was that if the executive government failed to consult the voice, or just didn't give it enough time to formulate advice on a really complex bill, the voice could take the government to the High Court.
And sue them?
Right. The fear was that the court might halt government decisions entirely, causing massive bureaucratic delays across all departments. Critics frequently pointed to the Waitangi Tribunal in New Zealand as a cautionary precedent for this.
How so?
Well, they argued that what started as a purely advisory body in New Zealand eventually gained this outsized quasi-judicial power over land and legislation through expansive, totally unpredictable court rulings over the decades.
It's like a debate over installing a radically new fire alarm system in a house. The supporters are saying, this is an essential upgrade. It's finally going to alert you to the real structural fires you've been ignoring for decades.
Right, a necessary warning system.
But the critics are looking at the exact same wiring schematic and saying, no, this system is overly sensitive. It's going to trigger the sprinklers and flood the entire house every single time someone makes a piece of toast.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that analogy captures the core of the constitutional anxiety perfectly.
Yeah.
But we also have to look at the supportive legal view, which fundamentally rejected the premise that the House would flood. You had the Solicitor General of Australia, Stephen Donoghue, and several retired High Court judges arguing that the voice would absolutely not fetter or impede Parliament.
Right. The sources include a very detailed legal analysis from the firm Gilbert plus Tobin, which explicitly addressed these exact anxieties.
And what did they conclude?
They stated that under the proposed amendment, there would be no constitutional obligation whatsoever for the executive to consult the voice prior to making decisions.
Zero obligation.
Zero. Furthermore, they argued that the High Court could not invalidate laws based on whether the Parliament had received or considered representations from the voice.
So the supportive argument was really that the voice was a practical, modest institution that would overcome historical barriers to participation without actually breaking the machinery of government.
Exactly.
The ultimate unknown of this alternate timeline, the thing we can never truly answer because the referendum failed, is how the High Court would have actually ruled in practice when the first dispute inevitably arose.
Because there would have been disputes.
Definitely. Would the judges have developed a standard of reasonableness for consultation that bogged down the bureaucracy and litigation, forcing the executive to prove they gave the voice enough time and information? Or would the High Court have maintained a strict deference to Parliament's authority, recognizing the voice as purely advisory? The answer to that single question would have determined the functional day-to-day reality of the voice.
It's a massive what if. But let's imagine for a moment that the voice was implemented, and they actually managed to navigate those early legal growing pains.
Okay, the optimistic scenario.
The High Court finds a balance, the bureaucracy adapts to co-design. What happens to the broader Australian identity in the years that follow? The sources suggest the ripple effects wouldn't just stop at Indigenous policy.
No, not at all.
They would have been staggering for the whole country.
The broader implications are truly profound. Remember the sequence outlined in the 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart Voice, Treaty, Truth?
Voice was just the beginning.
Exactly. The voice was only ever intended as step one. Its successful implementation would have inevitably accelerated the push for a Makarrata Commission.
Which is?
It's a body designed to oversee national treaty-making and truth-telling between governments and First Nations.
And honestly, just passing the referendum in the first place would have shattered a massive psychological barrier in Australian politics. Political scientists call it the frozen continent myth.
Yes, that myth is huge in the literature.
Historically, Australians almost always vote no to constitutional change. Before 2023, only 8 out of 44 referendums had ever passed.
It's a graveyard of referendums.
It really is. If the voice had succeeded, it would have proven that the modern Australian public is actually capable of complex, structural, constitutional deliberation. It changes the national self-image from static to totally dynamic.
Breaking that fear of change directly links to another massive constitutional issue detailed in our sources, the Australian Republic.
Go, right.
The argument is that this psychological shift, combined with the legal reality of the voice, could have reignited the Republican movement, which has been largely stalled since its own failed referendum in 1999.
Okay, I have to push back on that. I hear you. But the argument that giving First Nations people a specific advisory committee would serve as the ultimate catalyst to finally sever Australia's colonial tie to the British monarchy.
It sounds like a stretch.
It feels like a massive historical leap to make from the creation of a single advisory body. How does one actually trigger the other?
It does seem like a leap until you view it through the lens of that multinational federalism we discussed earlier.
Okay, bring it together for me.
As Australia seeks to legally externalize its relationship with Indigenous nations through domestic treaties, basically treating them as sovereign entities entering into agreements with the state, the entire constitutional architecture changes context.
Right.
You are formally acknowledging the pre-existing continuous sovereignty of First Nations peoples. In that context, the presence of a foreign British monarch acting as the ultimate crown and sovereign head of state over Australia becomes legally and symbolically anachronistic.
I see. Because if you are signing treaties that acknowledge the First Peoples as the original sovereigns of the land, it highlights how incredibly strange it is to have a king in London sitting at the very top of your constitutional pyramid.
Exactly. It creates a glaring contradiction.
The success of the voice would have refocused Australian national symbols on its First Peoples, rather than its colonial origins, making the logic of a republic far more compelling to the everyday voter.
Precisely that. And it also shifts Australia's position on the global stage. The sources note that a successful voice would have brought Australia into alignment with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRP.
Right, I've heard of UNDIP.
Specifically, Articles 18 and 19, which deal with the rights of Indigenous peoples to participate in decision-making and to be consulted through their own representative institutions.
And that isn't just about feeling good at the UN. That gives Australia tangible diplomatic leverage, particularly in its relationships with Pacific nations in Oceania, many of which have very strong Indigenous identities. It would have moved Australia away from being viewed as an outlier among former colonial nations like Canada and New Zealand, giving it much greater cultural legitimacy in regional geopolitics.
So what does this all mean? We spent this time exploring a fascinating, complex, alternate 2026, a timeline where Australia is navigating a double federation, where the executive branch is sitting in the kitchen co-designing policy with a national voice, and where the Republic movement is gathering real steam.
It's quite the picture.
But we have to snap back to the reality of today.
Yeah.
The alternate timeline remains a fantasy. The referendum failed. The Constitution remains silent on First Nations people. So what does this all mean for the actual state of the nation right now?
Well, the reality we see in the sources analyzing the aftermath of the failed referendum is a definitive drift away from cooperative federalism. Because the national mechanism for Indigenous representation failed, we are seeing a major shift toward competitive federalism.
Competitive federalism, meaning the states are just doing their own thing without any federal coordination.
Yes, exactly. To understand how that works, just look at Victoria. They are forging ahead with their own isolated treaty processes, such as the Uruk Justice Commission and negotiations with the First Peoples Assembly.
Right, they're not waiting around.
They're essentially doing the voice, treaty, truth sequence, but entirely fenced off within state borders. Queensland has also explored its own path to treaty, though the political winds there constantly shift.
What this creates is a highly inconsistent state-by-state patchwork of Indigenous rights and representation.
A total patchwork.
A First Nations person in Victoria might have a fundamentally different legal, consultative, and truth-telling relationship with their government than someone living in Western Australia or the Northern Territory.
Which is the exact opposite of a cohesive national narrative.
Exactly. And without that unified national voice, the ongoing struggle to implement the principle of not about us without us in administrative law remains incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
The federal bureaucracy still struggles to genuinely consult because the permanent constitutionally protected architecture to force them to do so was rejected by the electorate.
This raises an important question, one that gets to the very heart of how democracies evolve.
I'm listening.
If formal constitutional change is deemed too difficult, too politically fraught, or just too legally risky for a nation to undertake collectively, does true structural reform only ever happen quietly, state by state?
Oh, that's a brilliant point.
Do we have to fracture a nation's unified legal identity in order to slowly, incrementally achieve moral progress?
That is a heavy, lingering thought to leave you with. If the national fire alarm is considered too risky to install, you basically end up with every room in the house trying to invent its own way to detect the smoke.
Wow, yeah. Thank you for joining us on this counterfactual deep dive into the pages of history that were written but never actually published.
It's been a journey.
We hope it encourages you to keep exploring the history and the future of constitutional law. Keep questioning the structure of the world around you.